Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Robert Mugabe has ignored a demand from Zimbabwe's ruling ZANU-PF party to resign. Will Zimbabwe be better governed once the 3 decades-long leader is finally forced out? Presidents Xi and Trump's Asia-Pacific tours highlighted their different views on global governance. Can China compensate for the U.S. withdrawal from globalization? And we begin today's show with the ongoing Zimbabwe crisis. Zimbabwe's ruling ZANU-PF party has sacked a longtime president Robert Mugabe from the party. The party, led by ousted vice president, has also urged Mugabe to step down as president. But Mugabe defied these calls and even held a cabinet meeting on Tuesday. So who are the key players in Zimbabwe's political turmoil, and how have their actions led to this development?
It's hard to say whether the recent political upheaval is the ancient grudge between 93-year-old Robert Mugabe and his obedient aide of 40 years, Emmerson Mnangagwa, or if it's the consequences of an unbalanced relationship between government and military. After being sacked as vice president and dismissed from the parliament this week, Mnangagwa decided to snap back, and quickly. He called in a favor from his close ally in the army, Defense Force Commander General Constantino Chiwenga, and put the president in house arrest on Wednesday. Another key figure at the center of the storm is the president's second wife, Grace Mugabe, who depends solely on her husband's support in her political ambitions. Grace is not very respected among Zimbabweans, but she has shown great confidence in getting elected as vice president as soon as her husband survived the little bump. Mugabe himself is also running for the 2018 elections, despite being under house arrest. Looking back on his rule of almost 4 decades, Mugabe seems to have a way of getting out of political turmoil. In the 2008 elections, Mugabe's ZANU-PF party lost its parliamentary majority. He was defeated by opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai in the presidential vote. Mugabe was forced to form a power-sharing government and named his rival as prime minister. But Tsvangirai never managed to dent ZANU's dominance. In 2013, Mugabe's party abolished prime minister's post and passed a new constitution. But the recent political crisis has given the opposition hope again, and they are planning to continue their democratic campaigns once Mugabe is out of the picture.
A lot of is going on. For more on Zimbabwe's political crisis, we are joined in our Beijing studio, He Wenping, professor and director with the African Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, ma'am. In Nairobi, we have Muwenda Biziwe, who is a security consultant and CEO of ION Security. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we have Peter Pham, director of the Africa Center with the Atlantic Council. I want to welcome to the three of you. First of all, Mr. Biziwe, you are in Africa. Probably you have better knowledge than all of us in the rest of the world exactly what is going on now. We understand the parliament is already in sitting for a process that might be leading to the impeachment of President Mugabe. Exactly what is going on?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Greetings to my fellow panelists from China and Washington, D.C. What's going on in Africa, in Zimbabwe particularly right now, is the country got to a point where they needed change. However, President Mugabe, through his wife Grace, decided that the change would come through Grace inheriting presidency from the President Mugabe than from the people of Zimbabwe. And so the military stepped in. However, the military did not step in to mount a military coup. They stepped in, like they said, to arrest the criminals who are subverting the heart and the mind of the president. And I think they targeted the wife Grace and other people. So what's going on in Zimbabwe right now is a kind of a change, but that must be anchored in the constitution. And so I should call it a constitutional change, and we're not calling this a military coup, we're calling it a guardian coup.
Well, you might want to call it a guardian coup, but the others might have different interpretation of exactly what the nature of the incident. Therefore, let me go to you, Mr. Pham. There are things that we need to figure out to decide the nature of issues. One is, what is the role of the government? The role of government for Mr. Mugabe, the role of him in the military, and the role of him in his own party. So, Mr. Pham, now his party sacked him. He refused. He is still the president, though, of his country, even though many disagree with him. Thirdly, the military did not refuse to call him the head of the military as he used to be, and he is still today. So what exactly are we talking about here?
We're talking about the process has begun, and as my colleague in Nairobi has pointed out, a process to express the will of the people. And it's quite evident, given the fact that the ZANU-PF party controls a supermajority in Parliament, and it's unlikely that the opposition will disagree with their motion to impeach the president. It is only a matter of time before the constitutional process plays itself out and Robert Mugabe is removed.
So what do I do? Like
he is no longer head of the party. He is no longer head of the party, and he will, in a matter of days, unless he chooses to leave with what remains of his dignity voluntarily, he will be removed using constitutional means by act of Parliament.
Well, you might say so, but as we all know, the situation on the ground is not as easily interpreted as you would see on paper. That's why it's complicated, right? That's why we're talking about it. And that's why it's not like textbook issue. And Ms. He, let me ask you about this. The vice president, now on self-exile in South Africa, is reported by the Washington Post of so-called breaking away from the military. Then Mr. Mugabe continued with his work as the president, also holding cabinet meetings. He also went to university celebrations to award the students, and that is allowed by the military. We are not talking about black and white here. It's nothing easy. What do you think is really happening right now? It's very confusing.
Yeah, so far, just like a drama, there's all those turmoil and the political crisis in Zimbabwe, because all of a sudden we heard a lot of different stories, explanation, like this self-exile vice president now even had a breakaway with the military. That was a big shocking news to me, because it seems to be that he and with the military are bounded together. They have a joint hand to make these things happening.
But on the other hand, the media have been wrong in many of the cases reporting on this story over the past few days.
Right, but the military has enjoyed a very good reputation before for all those history. And from all the beginning when they sacked like house arrest Mugabe, and they also make very clear those documents, those statements. I read one by one all those statements. I think this is very clever statements, because they're calling for different those legislative things and different like media calling for tell them what they should to do. So it seems very, you see, it's not an ordinary military coup we have experienced before. So it's very different. It's very different.
So the question is, Mr. Bijiwe, that is, how will Mr. Mugabe remain the president of his country when the military seems to be cornered him, when he's removed from his party as the head of the party, when he's not necessarily cheered as the president of his country? But the thing is, he is still there. So how should we interpret this?
First of all, the military of Zimbabwe, like any other military in the world, is supposed to take an unpolitical position, which they call apolitical. They should not take any political position whatsoever. And that's why you see the Zimbabwean military is working this transition very, very carefully. They have to keep it constitutional. They have the power of the bullet. They can force Mugabe to sign that letter of resignation, but they want to be within the constitution. Now, the military of Zimbabwe has also been the same military that was in the regime of President Mugabe the whole time that he was in power. However, the military like any military in the world, is supposed to keep their hands off politics. And the military only comes in, and a few countries in Africa have seen that kind of intervention, where, for example, in Egypt, we saw the military, intervene in a very constitutional way after their presidents, were violating the constitution. So the military of Zimbabwe is within the context of change. However, they have to take this back to the people of Zimbabwe through the ZANU-PF party and through other instruments of government like the legislature, which is happening right now, so that there is change that is constitutionally anchored.
But we are talking about a long time to come, Mr. Pham, because if you start a parliament sitting, which is going on right now, only beginning on Tuesday, you have first round to accept the motion of the possible impeachment. Then you establish a committee to investigate about the so-called wrongdoings of the current president, Mr. Mugabe. Then after that report is done, you file it back to the parliament, and the parliament has to agree with the majority share of the voters there, eventually to sack the president. That is called impeachment. In the United States, that takes a long time. We remember that over the past few decades. So this could also be a pretty long process, Mr. Pham.
No, actually, it does not have to be that long.
Why
I think
not?
we're talking about a matter, because if you look at the Zimbabwean constitution, if you look at the actual facts on the ground, I think Parliament will move fairly quickly. Look at how quickly they moved. Just a few days ago, people were saying that the party would not meet until December. They met over the weekend and sacked the president as leader of the party. I think the Parliament will move within a matter of days. You saw over the weekend demonstrations where citizens of all backgrounds, supporters of ZANU-PF, supporters of the opposition, marched together with the military. So there is an expression of the will. I agree with my colleague in Nairobi. The military is acting very deliberately, very carefully within the bounds of constitutional legality. It's allowing the process to play itself out, but it's not a process that is interminable. And as for Mugabe trying to remain president, there is elections coming up in 2018 anyway, and now that he has been removed from the party, he has no platform from which to run for president. I can't imagine a scenario where he would be able to gather signatures of enough people around the country to present his name for the ballot. So the end is in sight.
All right. If Mr. Pham are exactly right, if he would step down, if the process is quick, if the election is being held next year, there's still months to go. Ms. He, that's why I want to ask you about this. There's a power vacuum right now. Okay, you say the military is not intervening into politics, then they're not deciding on the political matters. The president now certainly has become somebody that is not relevant that much anymore. The vice president is on self-exile, and the parliament is so much busy with the impeachment. Who is in power? What is going on with the rest of the days and the months to go, Ms. He?
Well, theoretically speaking, Robert Mugabe now is still the president of the Zimbabwe, even though he has been removed from this party leader, from his own party, but in name, he's still the chief commander even of the army. So it's very interesting thing to see. That's why he has been arranged even to join this university ceremony, graduation ceremony, because by name, he's also the president of that university.
That's right.
So, and also he will be arranged to make another speech, I think in a national, like a party plenary meeting. So it's very funny, but in real sense, of course, his power has been removed completely. Now he cannot make any decision towards any policy in Zimbabwe. So his power now has been taken away by real sense, but those titles are still there. So I think now the real power, of course, is in the military people. Military, because now it's in full charge of all those, like even including the media, the radio, the TV. So all those things now is in the hands of the media. But the media doesn't want to show themselves in the front stage. Yes, military, they don't want to show themselves in the front stage. So they need someone coming out to represent them.
Just to make things more complicated, you also have other players in the region, in Africa continent, for example, coming in as the interventionist, or trying to negotiate, bring parties together. But at the same time, they are absolutely against any ways of military coup. That is just going to be a strong no to that phenomenon. So, Mr. Pham, how should we understand the nature of things, and who will be the important players in determining the future of Zimbabwe? Your view?
I think certainly General Constantino Chiwenga, the chief of the defense force in Zimbabwe, is a key player, but also Emerson Mnangagwa, the former vice president, who is likely to be restored to the president. The Zimbabwean constitution has an unusual particularity that if the president is removed by parliament or resigns, the ruling party, the party that won the last election, has the right to elect, to designate someone to finish that term. One presumes that ZANU-PF will probably designate the former vice president, so it will be a transition to him. But also the opposition will probably play a role. Former Vice President Mnangagwa has excellent relations that he's developed in recent years and cultivated with Morgan Tsvangirai and other key opposition leaders. So I think he will also try to reach out to a broader constituency than just the ZANU-PF.
But Mr. Bijiwe, we just heard the news, as I said at the very beginning of this show, reporting from the media suggesting the vice president is breaking with the military. It used to be said that the vice president is having very close relationship with the military and was even considered as one of big power deciding how the military would act. And now we heard this news. Of course, we don't know whether this news could be 100% correct, but it does suggest more complexity for days and weeks to come.
Actually, I'm sure a lot of political leaders all over the world really admire and covet the influence that the vice president has over the military. It's very, very few political leaders in the world that can command that kind of respect and support from the military like the vice president commanded. And I think in the infrastructure of President Mugabe's government before, he must have tasked his vice president to be directly under the military, and him being a revolutionary, he must have had the military completely in his grip. He must have had their loyalty. He must have taken care of their social needs. And so for the military to come up, you know, after he's deposed and to say, no, we are going to demand that, you know, criminals around the president leave. Not very many political leaders get that kind of support from the military, and I can assure you, if that man, for any chance, becomes the president of Zimbabwe, we're going to see great change, especially the way he handles matters, national security, matters politics, because he has the entire support of the military.
Things are changing very fast, almost every day, the situation. We'll see what's going to happen. Before we go, I want to have a sentence or two, only a sentence to two, from every one of you. What are the factors most important for us to watch about what's going on in Zimbabwe? Mr. Bijiwe, you want to go first? A sentence or two. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bijiwe?
Sorry, I missed that part.
What to be the deciding factor of Zimbabwe? What to watch for us?
Yeah, the deciding factor is the adherence to the constitution of Zimbabwe and how the regional powers, especially the South Africa development partners or the SADC, are going to play into the whole issue.
I see.
But principally, they must stick to their constitution.
Mr. Pham?
I think the most important factor after we move past the transition is going to be how the international community engages with the new authorities in Zimbabwe. The country is in a terrible economic situation. The government budget gap is more than 4 times what it was thought. It's in hyperinflation. It needs the engagement of its international partners.
Ms. He, for the weeks and possibly months to go.
Well, I think maybe don't need such a long time like months, maybe just by counting the weeks, because everything will coming out as soon as possible.
Okay, what factors to watch?
Yeah, the next watch is the impeachment itself, but I don't think that will be the fundamental issue to decide Mugabe is down or not. Actually, he's down already.
All right, He Wenping. Mwenda Bijuwe, Peter Pham. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Still to come on our program. Presidents Xi and Trump's Asia-Pacific tours highlighted their differing views on global governance. How can the international system address the concerns of Trump supporters to ensure that it is a win-win in his version? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday live on CGTN. So far, it's been a busy November for both Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump. They have wrapped up their specific Asia-Pacific tours, during which their keynote speeches, leader summits have dominated the headlines. After almost a week, what's the impact? America first or the Chinese dream? Take a look at this.
They have been offering competing visions since the beginning of the year at the Davos Forum to the recently concluded APEC meetings. U.S. President Donald Trump stuck to his America First agenda, complaining free trade had cost millions of American jobs.
We are not going to let the United States be taken advantage of anymore.
While Chinese President Xi Jinping won applause by reiterating China's open attitude towards free trade and globalization.
开放带来进步，封闭必然落后。
China has proposed the Belt and Road Initiative and has founded the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, attracting members not just from the Asia-Pacific, but also from Europe and Africa. On the contrary, Trump has pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major trade deal with 12 APEC nations, arguing it would hurt U.S. economic interests.
If the TPP is actually approved, it will be catastrophic.
On the sidelines of the APEC meetings, trade ministers from the 11 remaining members agreed to proceed with the TPP, leaving many to wonder if the world is getting used to the U.S. withdrawal. And the U.S.'s growing reluctance in global governance has left an America-sized hole to fill. So will China be the one to take on more responsibility?
For more on this, we are joined in Washington, D.C. Scott Kennedy, who is the director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also editor of the recent book, Global Governance and China, The Dragon's Learning Curve. Mr. Kennedy, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much.
One thing people wonder, that is the international system that we're talking about right now is the one that is being built after the Second World War. But it is not just the international system itself. It's an abstract word. If you look at some entities, specifically the IMF, the World Bank, they are governed by board. And the board is made up of economies and countries who have different proportion of shares and therefore of decision-making rights. So we are not talking about some abstract entities vis-a-vis the rise of emerging economies such as China, but rather economies that might have conflicts or opportunities of cooperation with economies rising such as China. So, Mr. Kennedy, are we not necessarily tackling the real issue, but rather hide behind an abstract word which is called so-called international system?
Well, that's a good question of whose interests does the system represent, and is that reflected properly in the leadership of these institutions, or also the institutions or rules that don't exist that need to be challenged. Certainly, the IMF and World Bank have gradually adapted their leadership in terms of the voting power of their members. The IMF took a little extra time, in part because of the U.S. Congress, to change its voting to give China a greater share, and that's going to be adjusted again next year. But, you know, these are systems, organizations in which everyone needs to contribute or look for additional solutions in organizations. I think the creation of AIIB is one of those types of efforts that tries to fill a hole or address issues that the World Bank wasn't addressing, and some of the reforms that AIIB is proposing may encourage the World Bank to change and become better. So the growth of new institutions is supposed to be a positive challenge to existing ones to make them better. Some people talk about fragmentation of the system, which is certainly something one needs to be concerned about, but pluralization of the system, I think, is something to be welcomed, particularly when global power seems to be pluralizing as well.
On the other hand, what about the United States? You know, one of the major builder of the so-called international system that are still relevant today. It seems to be going bilateral by this administration, and therefore, is it going to be relevant to the so-called international system if the builder of the system already withdraw? Who else would hold on to it?
Sure, that's a great point. Systems need leadership, and the U.S. and Europe provided a lot of leadership after World War II to create multilateral institutions that govern trade, in the financial system, and foreign aid. I think what we're seeing now are strains in the United States about who are the winners from this system, and I think this is partly a result of growing inequality in the United States, part of which is being blamed on globalization, and maybe some of that is true to some extent, but there's also just an anxiety about the world, and that's why I think the Trump administration has moved in this very sort of defensive crouch position, which we saw in the very different type of speeches that President Trump and President Xi Jinping gave at APEC just last week. Hopefully, the U.S. Finds a new balance that reflects the importance of the system, that it needs to be reformed and not discarded, because it's been obviously mutually beneficial for the United States, for China, and for much of the world.
When you talk about so-called the new balance, a phrase you just used, Mr. Kennedy, where would that come from, the inspiration for the United States to hold on to it, something like a new balance, Mr. Kennedy? Explain, please.
Sure. Well, I think the U.S. obviously has benefited tremendously from this system. It's also a big provider of global public goods in this system. In some ways, the U.S. global trade deficit that it's had for a long time has encouraged countries to export and helped growth everywhere. The dollar-based system has also facilitated global trade and investment. But I think that within the United States, if you go around this country, you'll find people in different industries in different states who are highly anxious about globalization, who see the obvious job losses in their sectors, but not the gains that also come. And so I think the Republican and Democratic parties, interest groups in the United States are trying to figure out how can you make sure that we have an inclusive growth.
But you know, Mr. Kennedy, the word inclusive certainly is beautiful, but it depends on whose inclusiveness are we talking about. When the system is not in the favor of the builder, for example, the United States talk about so-called inclusiveness, but I guess that inclusiveness is about domestic inclusiveness rather than inclusiveness of the other economies, because the other economies, Mr. Kennedy, are actually benefiting right now to a certain extent from the current existing system. So is the United States trying to change the system fundamentally, once again, bring it to its own favor?
I think the U.S. is trying to make sure that this system works for everyone, including the U.S. I think that, you know, you have to remember...
Come on, Mr. Kennedy. The U.S. is trying to make sure the system is going to work for everyone. That just sounds beautiful. Sure. Remember, at the very beginning of building of the system, right after the Second World War, not everyone was being consulted, not even like a big country like China, but rather a few powers decided on the fate of the current system. How can you expect the United States now, quote, work for everybody's favor? Is it realistic, or is it too naivety that we're talking about here?
Sure. Well, okay, if we go back to the end of World War II and this system that we have is a political compromise. The U.S. and Europe didn't agree on everything, and this system has evolved and changed over time. Most of the changes that the U.S. has been pushing, if we look just before Trump Trump's arrival was with regard to TPP was about filling in blanks in the system where there weren't any rules related to, example, for state-owned enterprises, for investment, for e-commerce, and those creation of those rules in some ways benefit the U.S. because they have a comparative advantage in some of these areas, but at the same time they are really much more important than they used to be, and having clear rules will be beneficial to everyone. So we even see in RCEP an organization that China is trying to help create, addressing some of these rules, and the WTO as well. So everybody, my hope is that the U.S., China, and other large powers see that their stake is in the system, in reforming it, not in exiting it, because that would have massive detrimental effects to everybody. And so, you know, I'm concerned about those nationalist populist voices that we hear in many quarters.
But Mr. Kennedy, the question really is, will the rest of the world wait for the United States while your country is trying to struggle out a kind of a united solution within your own politics, or the rest of the world going to move forward on their own without the United States? And what would that mean to your country?
You're absolutely right.
And to the others?
Yes, I think Tianwei, you're 100% correct. That's why we see negotiations continuing forward with the TPP 11, in RCEP, in other organizations. So the U.S. has a strong benefit from active participation, and I think there are some in Washington who hope that, you know, the current turn in American politics ends after 4 years and the U.S. becomes internationalist again. But by 2020, the rules will have changed, and it won't be the same. You know, when you stick your foot in the river at different times, it's a different river. And so the U.S. is going to need to step up and show additional leadership. This concern about bilateral trade balances is not probably sufficient, in my mind, to address the big concerns that we face from global organizations and that they need to tackle. There are many bigger issues that need to be addressed. And of course, integrating China into this system is a crucial part of what we need to focus on.
Integrating China into the system, many wonder, Mr. Kennedy, is that too late a phrase already to be used? Because China is already part of the system. China is even working with the other countries leading on some of the initiatives that you just mentioned yourself. So it's about integrating China into the system, or reintegrate the United States, if the latter is willing to do so, into the system again.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Obviously, China's been an active participant in global governance institutions since at least the 1980s, rejoined the UN in the early 70s, and China holds leadership positions across the system. I guess when I'm talking about integration is, given the size of China's economy, it's just simply the gravity of China's economy, the economic weight it has an effect on who gets what in lots of different industries and sectors. China's overcapacity issues, for example, affect global markets. And so the rules and the systems need to be adapted so that we can have a flexible system that somehow deals with those kinds of challenges that are simply just the product of China's size, not even just the type of policies that it pursues. But in addition, you know, China is highly concerned, for example, about the stability of the international financial system.
Right.
That's a system which is focused on liquidity. And so there's adaptation, whether it's for China or for the system or for existing players. I think everybody is in need of figuring out how to reform the system.
When we talk about the international system and the way it should work, I guess one of the things it could learn is about why some of the countries or economies are doing well while others do not necessarily so. If that is one of the standards people can use, and then it would be important for the system to study what is going on in China, because after all, this economy is doing relatively well. So what are the standards that were used before the models that were used before, the examples that were used before in portraying the existing system are still relevant to us anymore? Or actually, many of these poles, standing poles, has to be moved and changed, Mr. Kennedy?
Sure. Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a debate that we are working through in real time right now.
Exactly.
The fundamental foundation of the international system post-World War II was that openness to the global economy was beneficial not only for those that opened their economies, but for everybody else in. And I think there are exceptions that are built into the rules in cases of the environment, protecting national security and such. But this idea of openness being critical and beneficial to everybody. And then to the extent that countries face problems, that's part of their domestic politics to resolve. I think the rise of China suggests an alternative to some extent where it's, you know, although it's openness at a very gradual pace in certain sectors where the state plays a larger role. And that's a conversation that, because of China's successful example, we are seeing occur at the WTO, in other institutions, and certainly from the 19th Party Congress, where General Secretary Xi focused on the idea of the Chinese example and experience for others. And so that's why we are seeing a great debate about the role of the state and the importance of openness.
Mr. Kennedy, at the end of the day, when we talk about the international system, we don't want to be just politically correct. We want to go to the bottom of this. What exactly is the deciding factor, after studying the so-called international governance for such a long time, Mr. Kennedy, is deciding on the fate of the international system? Does money speak? Is ideology the ultimate, deciding factor? Or is it about a kind of thought leadership that would eventually deciding on the fate of the international system? What exactly is it, Mr. Kennedy?
Tianwei, I think I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory professor-like answer, which says all of these things matter.
Okay.
Power, money, interest groups matter a lot. The other thing, diplomacy, your diplomatic skills, both officials and non-state actors in NGOs. There are diplomatic skills to know the written and unwritten rules. Actually, China has performed remarkably, even in situations where it doesn't have a lot of hard power. You'll see, of course, just your ability to adapt and learn, the flexibility of your domestic institutions effect. So I don't think what we have is a straight line direction where we're headed. We've got a multiple competing factors that are shaping the direction of the international system. I hope that the competition over ideas is going to proceed peacefully, and that competition should be welcomed. And in 10 years, if we come back and talk about this, hopefully we'll see a system that is adapted to address some of the big challenges that not only the U.S. and China face, but the world faces, because without that type of adaptation, the problems are going to get larger, and the differences are going to grow.
Mr. Kennedy, I wonder, Mr. Kennedy, I wonder whether that really takes 10 years, as you just said. At the end of the day, when there is dramatic change in the world, there are likely to be vacuums. Those vacuums are likely to be filled by new players. In order to debate and deciding on the fate of these vacuums, there's likely to be competition, and there's always possibility of cooperation. What would you mean? What would you say about this, the nature of what we are experiencing right now? If I go back into my country's history, to me it sounds like the Warring States period of time. There are so many thoughts going on, so many different possibilities where a country and the world can go. From your American experience, where are we? Where are we going?
Sure. Well, I think there are concerning signs about fragmentation of the system, views that the system doesn't work for us, and the rise of nationalist, populist movements. But I think what has to be done is argue that this diversification is a positive, pluralistic movement And those who see the benefits of globalization and how international institutions have helped need to make their arguments better domestically and vis-a-vis others. And so I think that's an important balance or conflict that we're having right now. I think the global system has largely been beneficial, although there's some that have not fared as well as they should have, and to me that speaks to the need for reform, not junking the system. And you know, there's this big debate within countries, between countries. I think the China has provided a lot more public goods than it used to in the past. It used to primarily be a recipient of those. But what type of public goods are needed? How should they be provided? What organizations should do so? The Belt and Road is an example of one new effort in that direction. And so obviously that is a key individual aspect to watch going forward. And hopefully the U.S. and China and others will try and figure out how to make the Belt and Road and other initiatives to build infrastructure work for everybody.
Scott Kennedy, the editor of the newly published book, which is called Global Governance and China, the Dragon's Learning Curve. We are all, I guess, on a learning curve. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.